Thanks, Andy. So we've just commemorated, but not celebrated, the 80th anniversary of the atom bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and marked the 70th anniversary of the Russell-Einstein Manifesto against nuclear war. I'm going to look at some of the context, books and publications which Russell consulted and read, as well as a couple of other additional documents, including some comic books, in order to give you a bit of context. And then, of course, Tony will discuss the enduring impact of the Russell-Einstein Manifesto. And Tom, I guess, will cover the proposed purchase by Great Britain of the US F-35 planes, along with their handy-dandy B-61 tactical or strategic, it's your choice, atom bombs. So let me begin. I hope everybody's able to see this. And I'll just say, for 1945, the first news of the A-bomb was this book, Atomic Energy for Military Purposes by Henry D. Smythe. And this was issued by the authority of General Groves, who was the overall military commander of the atomic bomb project, the Manhattan Project, very soon after the August 6th and 9th atom bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There's a second printing of it, which included as well brief reports of British, the Tube Alloy, and Canadian contributions at Petawawa and also at Montreal to the development of the bomb. And the report itself was, minus some restrictions, quite explicit about nuclear reactions and production of U-235 and plutonium-239 bombs. And I actually recommend it to anybody who wants to get a very good history of the production of the bombs and a fair amount, but not too much, of the theory behind it. The author was Henry Smythe, a physics professor at Princeton University, who also served as a consultant for the Manhattan Project, and he wrote the report at the request of General Groves. He subsequently became one of the 5 commissioners on the Atomic Energy Commission of the US. And I say here, he opposed the development of the H-bomb. Well, he initially did, and then he was won over to it. But he was the sole member of the AEC to vote in favor of Robert Oppenheimer during his trial for security clearance. And he subsequently worked for non-proliferation of nuclear weapons and opposed Reagan's Star War project. Smythe's report was initially mimeographed and stapled. Copies were circulated to a limited, though fairly large group, and then destroyed, save for a few copies now for sale on the internet. And if anybody has several $1,000s, they can actually purchase it. An intermediary printing, and this is where Russell comes in, between the limited lithographed issue and the widely circulated Princeton University Press, the yellow dust jacket edition, were these 2 large pamphlet editions, also in 1945. The U.S. Government Printing Office produced a version, same as the text of the yellow dust jacket one, as well as His Majesty's stationery office, a copy of which is in the Russell Library. So Russell had that and certainly could consult it. Just as a sidelight, here's another book which came out also immediately. In fact, this is The Atomic Age Opens on the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It came out in August of 1945 at the same time as the Smythe version. But it's interesting because it was produced in the format of a wartime book in order to fit into the pockets of GI's uniforms. And at the bottom right-hand corner, it says, share this book with someone in uniform. It subsequently came back out as a full hardback version as well. So Russell and the H-bomb back in 1945. So there was a fair amount of knowledge about it, certainly the A-bomb, but there was certainly less knowledge, in fact, very little knowledge about the H-bomb. And of course, that's what we're interested, especially today in. Russell was aware as of an early date, November 28, 1945, of the possibility of an even more destructive weapon, and that's the hydrogen bomb, as he warned in his House of Lords debate. This was one of the 5 times he actually intervened in that noble body, and he said, quote, "The present atomic bomb, in exploding, produces temperatures which are thought to be about those in the inside of the sun. It is therefore possible that some mechanism, analogous to the present atomic bomb, could be used to set off this much more violent explosion, which could be obtained if one could synthesize heavier elements out of hydrogen. And of course, some mechanism, that's radiation implosion, which until very recently, and even to this day, is considered as a secret. And Russell continues, as I go about the streets and see St. Paul's, the British Museum, the Houses of Parliament, and the other monuments of our civilization, in my mind's eye, I see a nightmare version of those buildings as heaps of rubble with corpses all around them. It is not enough to make war rare. Great and serious war has got to be abolished, because otherwise these things will happen. So we see here two themes: concern about H-bombs quite early, and also the civilization devastating and perhaps omnicidal effects of nuclear war. Just again, I'm not going to spend much time on this, but here is what American youth were looking at around the same time. These are from the period of 1951 to 53, so it's during the period of the Korean War. And these were a series of comics, three separate series, Atomic Wars, which is headline, Only a Strong America Can Prevent Atomic War. But in the four issues that did come out, there was plenty of nuclear explosions, Atomic Attack, and then a third one, Atom Age Combat, where they tried to create a hero, Buck Vincent, I guess on the model of Buck Rogers. These were sort of short-lived comics, but I guess American youth at the time concerned about the Korean War, and you can see in the second one, in Atomic Attack, it's not Russians who are being the aggressors. Of course, it's Asian types due to the war in Korea. More serious considerations, the Voyage of the Lucky Dragon. This came out in 1957, but as you know, it deals with the 1954, the March 1954 explosion of Castle Bravo at the Bikini Atoll. That was a nuclear hydrogen bomb, which had a greater effect than had been anticipated due to an underestimation of the role played by one of the lithium isotopes involved in the lithium deuteride package. And as a result, the area of exclusion wasn't sufficient to protect boats from the fallout, and the Lucky Dragon, a Japanese fishing vessel, was caught in the extended area of fallout, Black Rain as it was called at the time, and one of the seamen on board, the chief radio officer, died as a result. So he was probably the first recorded case of someone to die from a hydrogen bomb explosion. And that happens just before Russell's December 23rd, 1954 talk, Man's Peril from the Hydrogen Bomb. The other two books I'm just mentioning in passing, one is Henry Kissinger's 1957 Nuclear Weapons and Foreign Policy, where really for the first time, this was a result of a study authorized by the Council on Foreign Relations, one of the prestigious nonpartisan groups in the United States, which still exists today. And he was one of the first to consider seriously limited nuclear warfare. That is to say, warfare which would not go to the extent of a massive exchange of all nuclear weapons on the two sides, but limited somehow, you have to read his book to find out, to a much smaller exchange. On the other hand, of course, we have Kahn's 1960 on thermonuclear war. Russell has this in his library, and he read it very carefully. There are at least 45 notations, not text, but rather pencil drawings into the margins of pages that Russell thought were significant. And Kahn himself, in a subsequent book, a couple of years later, came up with 44 stages of war, of which number 20 marked the beginning of limited nuclear war. So then there were almost a Dr. Strangelove kind of presentation. So these provide something of the context. Here is, of course, Russell, who was not alone in his concern, and his concern was largely on the question of fallout. And here you have the British edition of No More War that came out in 1960 by Linus Pauling, with the blurb, the dust jacket blurb from Russell. And as you know, Russell was a supporter of Pauling when Pauling had difficulties going to Britain to give a presentation precisely on the danger of nuclear war. And again, he too focused on the question of fallout. The effects of nuclear weapons, Russell had, in following the Man's Peril talk, communicated with Indian Prime Minister Nehru about a third party, such as India, preparing a book on the effects of nuclear weapons. And in fact, such a work was produced in India in June of 1956 with the second revised edition in 58. I think Russell had the revised edition of 58. The book, over 300 pages with technical appendices as well, focuses on fallout and its immediate and long-term, including genetic effects. The US government, it's the one on the right, issued a over 300-page work the year following, in 1957, focusing more on blast and heat effects, though including the problem of fallout as well. On the Beach. I don't know if you've seen this movie. It came out in 1959 based on the 1957 Neville Shute novel. In 59, the movie starred Gregory Peck and Ava Gardner with Fred Astaire and Anthony Perkins, quite a cast. And the idea is that in the nuclear war of 1964, all of life in the Northern Hemisphere has been exterminated by the immediate blast, but also by fallout. And there is a cloud of fallout, which is now going into the Southern Hemisphere. How scientifically correct that is irrelevant. A sole surviving US submarine, a nuclear submarine, makes its way to Australia. In the movie, of course, it's captained by Gregory Peck, to find out if there may be anyone spared from the advancing nuclear cloud of fallout. And of course, there are people in Australia, but they're looking for also folks outside, and hope for any sound of life elsewhere. Turns out to be a Coke bottle. You see it in the right-hand image from the film, suspended on a window shade, randomly knocking a telegraph key. It's a rather haunting scene, creating just noise and not a message from a survivor outside of Australia. The final scene shows the empty streets of Australian cities, devoid of life because the radioactive cloud, the fallout, has exterminated them, after the sub leaves to continue its futile and lonely mission. A baneful waltzing Matilda plays to the wordless soundtrack that goes on for 4 minutes. Russell went to see the film, and I saw this somewhere noted in the Russell archives. Ken, you can probably direct me to it, because I'd like to actually have the explicit reference. And this no doubt reinforced his view that nuclear war leads to omnicide. So we're at the effects of nuclear weapons. And there are really three categories: the production of blast, heat, and light, as for ordinary chemical explosions, but significantly orders of magnitude, thousands of times, millions of times greater. And Russell was certainly aware of all that. Secondly, the effects of radiation and radioactive byproducts as fallout, and Russell focused especially on fallout. And other effects, I'll talk about that very briefly: electromagnetic pulse, breakdown of sanitation and health systems, and nuclear winter. I'll go through this briefly. Blast, heat, and light, this is well known. Radiation effects, prompt, that is to say, immediate, fallout, short term, and then genetic effects, which can go into the next generation. And then the electromagnetic effects, which is that there is an EMP pulse from a nuclear weapon, which will, as they say, fry the electronics, including this computer, your car, and anything else which has electronics in it, including transmission wires for electricity and so forth, that is not appropriately shielded. You'll be pleased to know that military equipment associated with nuclear weapons is shielded, so they can still launch those things even after an explosion. Nuclear winter, this was developed as a theory and as only after Russell's time, and that is the consequence of dirt and ground matter being uplifted in the column of a nuclear blast, entering into the atmosphere and circulating around the Earth, blocking out sunlight and causing the failure of agriculture with the horrific consequences that would have. And a third one, which has only been discussed, that there was a made-for-TV film, I think it was called The Day After, which showed what happens in the aftermath of a nuclear attack on a small Midwestern town near a missile launching site, and that is the collapse of the healthcare system, collapse of water purification, sanitation systems, but also the destruction of hospitals, the killing of and wounding of and disabling of doctors and nurses, and the civil disorder that would ensue among survivors. Well, I had one more slide, but it's not here for the moment. Oh, yes, here it is. Types of nuclear weapons and new weapons. So we, of course, have the strategic nuclear weapons, the triad of land, air, and submarine. There are now 6 countries, including India, which have means of launching nuclear weapons from land, air, and submarines. And North Korea may be heading in that direction as well, involving both fission and fusion weapons. Tactical nuclear weapons, that is to say, weapons in the kiloton range, involved in land and sea mines, artillery shells. You have on the left there a firing of the atomic cannon, a 285 millimeter shell, which was fired once in 1954. In fact, that's the only time that a nuclear weapon has been fired from a cannon, but it certainly can be done. And now we can have, including, of course, cruise missiles, which can be launched from submarines with nuclear warheads, and also neutron bombs. Neutron bombs, incidentally, are simply hydrogen bombs without the U-238 cladding, which is actually the bulk of the explosive power of a hydrogen bomb. And now, thirdly, we have new weapon systems, hypersonic missiles, drones, either remotely controlled or autonomous, cyber warfare, space warfare, and artificial intelligence-based warfare. Finally, we have the new nuclear weapon states, India, Pakistan, North Korea, and Israel, joining the Big Five. So the conclusion to which I arrive is that Russell's anti-nuclear weapon and anti-war stance needs to be continued today due to the persistent nuclear threats and amplified to take into account new weapon systems and means of waging war. That's my show for today. Tony, you're muted, so you have to unmute yourself.
Yep, is that better?
Yes, go ahead.
Good. Thank you, David, and thank you for that tour of parts of the nuclear library, which is now quite extensive in both book and film. I want to, in addition to the 2 anniversaries you mentioned of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, of course, and of the Russell Einstein Manifesto 7 decades ago, there was a 3rd anniversary, which was the of the award of the Nobel Peace Prize to Joseph Rotblat and to the Pugwash Conferences on Science and World Affairs. And that was made 30 years ago in 1995. And Pugwash is an enduring international institution, which is undergoing something of a renaissance, in my opinion. I attended the recent meeting at the Royal Society in London to mark the 70th anniversary of the launch of the Russell Einstein Manifesto. That was quite an achievement on the part of Pugwash in Britain to persuade or to collaborate with the Royal Society. It was well prepared. It was well attended. Some people attending this Zoom meeting will have been able to have followed it online, and the recording is available online at the Pugwash website. How is it that this resolution, endorsed by just 9 signatories, I think it was, in 1955, continues to resonate? Well, I think there are a couple of points. One is that in reading the text of the manifesto, I find a couple of difficult points. The resolution itself, which is quite brief, a few lines, says that in any future world war, nuclear weapons will certainly be employed. So we must assume or deduce that there hasn't been a world war since 1955, as nuclear weapons haven't been employed. But there have certainly been plenty of wars. I don't know whether you can see me,
sorry, can I just butt in there? Giovanni is, I don't know which Giovanni it is because there's two of them, but somebody started screen sharing and I can't could you it's shrinking Tony's
yeah, I've got a black screen.
Okay, that's better. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah,
very good.
Carry on, Tony. Sorry.
Thank you. Yeah, I was talking about some of the ambiguities in the appeal. This is the Russell Einstein Manifesto appeal, and that the assertion that in any future World War nuclear weapons will certainly be employed. I don't know whether that's true or not, and certainly for the 70 years since the appeal was launched, it's been the case that although there's not been a world war, there have been a number of times when we've been close to nuclear war in different locations. Of course, this peril endures. In February of this year, in the Oval Office, President Trump told President Zelensky of Ukraine, "You're gambling with World War III." And during his press conference in Britain a few days ago with Prime Minister Starmer, Trump said of the Russian-Ukraine war, "It doesn't affect the United States, other than if you end up in a world war over this thing. You could," he said. That's a war that could have been a third world war. And I don't think we're going to be there now. But that was heading to a third world war. And what a shame it is, he added. So that continuing possibility of world war certainly looms in his consciousness. I'm not so sure that the appreciation of the risk of world war or of nuclear war is as prominent in the awareness of some European politicians and leaders. This is where the Russell Einstein Manifesto and Pugwash come in, I think, because the Pugwash conferences will have their 63rd meeting in Hiroshima in November this year. And that will be an occasion to mark certainly the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and of Nagasaki, but also I think to alert the governments of the world and also the scientists, but also the wider public of the continuing risk, the peril that we continue to live under. So the second point made in the resolution was that we urge governments of the world to realise and to acknowledge publicly that their purpose cannot be furthered by world war. And Russell also makes the point that he doesn't think it's possible simply by arms agreements to roll back the risk of destruction in a nuclear war. He says that people hope that perhaps war may be allowed to continue provided modern weapons are prohibited. This is in the appeal again, the Russell Einstein Manifesto. Russell says this hope is illusory. Whatever agreements do not use H-bombs had been reached in time of peace, they would no longer be considered binding in time of war. But then he qualifies the illusory position in these terms. Although an agreement to renounce nuclear weapons as part of a general reduction of armaments would not afford an ultimate solution, it would serve certain important purposes. First, any agreement between East and West is to the good, insofar as it tends to diminish tension. Second, the abolition of thermonuclear weapons would lessen the fear of sudden attack. Well, this is where Pugwash comes in very much, I think, because it's kept the attention of scientists, but also of the wider community on the continuing nuclear peril, notwithstanding the ending of the Cold War. And now we seem to be into a subsequent period which is altogether far more volatile. It was in January of 2022 that the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council, the United States, Russia, United Kingdom, France, and China, affirmed that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. This was a few weeks before Russia invaded Ukraine. The P5 continued, "We remain committed to our nuclear non-proliferation treaty obligations to pursue negotiations in good faith on effective measures relating to cessation of the nuclear arms race at an early date and to nuclear disarmament, and on a treaty on general and complete disarmament under strict and effective international control." Now, since January 2022, things have got considerably worse in this direction. I think it's reasonable to assess. Tom will tell us some more about the more recent developments in the UK. But if you read the SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute assessments, then there's still something like 12 to 13,000 nuclear warheads. Their number has been reducing a little because some have become out of date. But Hans Christensen, who is the author of this assessment, a prominent member of the American Federation of Scientists, assesses that the warhead numbers will increase and that the modernization of nuclear systems will increase. And since he wrote that piece, we've had the demonstration of the Oreshnik weapon. He has one line on that, but that was a very impressive, in the sense of unexpected, attack on Ukraine by a new Russian ballistic missile. After the Russell-Einstein Manifesto was launched in 1955, shortly after, a few days after, there was the Geneva Conference of the Big Four, the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and France. I was reading Andy Bone's account of these events in volume 28 of the collected papers earlier today. I mean, it was clear that this was actually a moment when hopes were improving after the successful launch of the manifesto. There was actually some movement on the international scene as well. The Korean War had been concluded, if not satisfactorily ended, and there was a thaw underway in the Soviet Union following Stalin's death in '53. There was Andy comments that Russell was affected by the optimism of that period in July '55. Do we have any prospect of something similar happening now? Would it be the case that if the war in Ukraine was brought to an end, that there would be some momentum for the nuclear powers to come together and start to renew some of the agreements that have expired and are due to expire on the control of nuclear weapons? Meanwhile, the civil society continues to pay attention to the Russell-Einstein Manifesto. Earlier this year, there was an appeal initiated by Italian scientists, a manifesto against rearmament. This is a project to resist the drive within the European Union to spend large sums of money, or make large sums of money available for national governments to spend on armaments. This is in the context of the United States withdrawing somewhat from its NATO engagements in Europe. And the scientists invoked the Russell-Einstein Manifesto as an example of the responsibility of the new generation of scientists and intellectuals and others to address the nuclear threat. So on that note, I'll hand over, more contemporary note, I'll hand over to my colleague, Tom Unterrainer.
Thanks very much, Tony. Take it away, Tom.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, David, and thank you to the BRS for organising this meeting. The purpose of what I'm going to say is just to survey one particular aspect of a wider and intensifying problem of nuclear proliferation and the corresponding and acute sharpening of nuclear risks. So we know that each of the 9 nuclear armed states are actively involved in developing new capabilities, either by technological developments or by increasing their nuclear warhead stocks. And it would take several hours to describe and account for all of this, such as the range and intensity of these developments. So I'll focus on one particular aspect of what's going on in the hope that it illustrates more general problems and more general trends and gets us to consider those. And this particular aspect is what Hans Christensen, the director of the Nuclear Information Project of the Federation of American Scientists, has described as the first increase of US tactical nuclear weapons in Europe since the Cold War. And that in itself should, get our attention, because the last time such an increase in tactical, that is weapons, nuclear weapons, deliberately designed, manufactured and deployed and intended for what they call battlefield use. The last time that occurred, the Russell Foundation was centrally involved in organising a continent-wide transnational campaign, European Nuclear Disarmament. This campaign can call for the creation of a European nuclear weapon-free zone, and thousands across Europe, across the political and the geographic divide, rallied to the call. No such zone was created, but the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty that had prohibited a class of ground-launched nuclear missiles with ranges between 500 and 5,500 kilometres was agreed between the US and the then Soviet Union, at least in part due to the pressure exerted by the end campaign. The INF diffused a potentially deadly standoff between the two major nuclear powers of the time. But the eventual fate of the INF treaty illustrates a central part of the problem we're now confronted with. But Trump's 2018 announcement of US withdrawal from the INF was not an isolated incident. It was part of a wider process that's been described as a bonfire of the treaties. In 2018 and since, I've described this bonfire as part of a process where the US government is tearing up treaties, agreements and deals with the deliberate intention of redrawing global rules to the US's own advantage. And this process has intensified as the US held firm to an America First international doctrine as the basis for US global dominance, the exertion of power, and this is important because those aspects, the reality of US global dominance and the dominance of US power has been drastically undermined by the rise of alternative centres of power, which hold very different points of view. As the US nuclear-armed NATO alliance has expanded and increasingly adopted global aspirations, treaty after treaty and agreement after agreement have been shattered. It's in this context that we need to look at the first increase of US tactical nuclear weapons in Europe since the Cold War. It's part of the same picture. So a deal has been struck between the British and US governments to purchase US-made, designed and manufactured F-35As at an estimated cost of $80 million each. And we expect these aircraft to arrive in the UK in 2029. Now, the F-35s are specifically designed to carry, and the euphemism they used, deliver the new US B-6112 nuclear bombs. A recent strategic defence review carried out in the UK commits this country to enhanced participation in NATO's nuclear mission. Now, this very recent development follows a parallel development that has been in the works for some time. The Lakenheath Air Base, a United States Air Force base in Suffolk, England, not that far from Cambridge, like a 20-minute drive from Cambridge, had been earmarked for development to allow it to store nuclear weapons once more. Repeated requests for clarification from the British government have been met with the same response, which went a bit like this. Now, when asked what's happening at Lakenheath, what are the plans, what does Britain's ally, the United States, intend to do there, a succession of British government ministers have responded like this. The British government does not comment on US military decisions. No comment at all, even though the decisions involve nuclear weapons and an air base in England. It's now believed that these new B-6112 nuclear bombs have arrived at Lakenheath. And you can read in the most recent issue of The Spokesman, which is upcoming, a detailed report on this. And it's also likely that they've arrived at several other bases in Europe that operate as part of NATO's nuclear sharing arrangements. There are bases in Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, 2 in Italy, and possibly in Turkey also. But there's a question mark about whether the new B-6112s have actually been delivered there. The B-6112 is a replacement for previously deployed US nuclear gravity bombs, but it's also an enhancement in terms of capabilities. These bombs have a steerable, that's the technical term they use, capability, which increases their accuracy, and they have a dialable yield, which means that they can generate an explosion, a force yield, ranging between the atomic bombs that were detonated at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, up to explosions many, many, many more times powerful. So questions of proliferation, international law, and the very concept of defence are in play, because successive British governments have claimed that the submarine-based Trident nuclear weapon system is the ultimate guarantor of security. In his speech launching the Strategic Defence Review, Prime Minister Starmer praised the continuous at-sea deterrence, as it's called, operation, which is named Relentless. Now, Relentless has kept these islands, apparently, so we're told, safe for decades now. But in reality, continuous at-sea deterrence continues to be plagued with difficulties. Yet this mission is regularly heralded as the unique dependable means by which the UK is ultimately defended. If this is the case, if these submarine-based, submarine-launched nuclear weapons are the ultimate guarantor, then why does the British government need to buy 12 US nuclear-capable F-35A aircraft? And why the need for discussions on UK enhanced participation in NATO's nuclear mission? What's going on? Why, for the first time since 1998, does Britain need a second air force, an air deployed leg, to its nuclear capabilities, if it's already ultimately and steadfastly guaranteed of its security via the Trident system? How to explain this most recent example of nuclear proliferation other than as a deal to further extend US, that is President Trump's, power? Was Britain's agreement to become home to yet more US nuclear weapons influential in the recent US-UK trade deal? What is going on? And there are a whole number of questions here that we simply don't have a direct, honest and open answer to. Because when the questions are put, when CND and other organisations put these questions to the British government, we get the same reply. We do not comment on these developments. So there is a massive democratic gap and democratic deficit here. So there are very many questions, but very few clear answers from either US or UK governments. What's clear is that this is yet another example of nuclear proliferation from both the US and UK governments. And it's an example of nuclear proliferation at stark odds with their professed commitment to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, for instance, of which the UK and the US are signatories. Not only signatories, but two states which declare that the NPT, this treaty in particular, is the cornerstone of the global nuclear order, and which is something they seriously are committed to and wish to stick to. So the recent examples around Iran, you can see how the NPT is used as an excuse, in inverted commas, for various actions there. But specifically, the first increase, as Hans Christensen described it, of US tactical nuclear weapons in Europe since the Cold War is in direct breach of the principle of irreversibility in non-proliferation. And this principle can be described as follows. Once a country dispenses with a certain nuclear capability, it may never have it back. And I think we can all see and understand why that is an important part of this process. The UK renounced its air-deployed nuclear capabilities in 1998. According to the principle of irreversibility, it should not have them back. And all of this poses the question, who will stop the breach? Who will stop this constant contravention of the core principles of the NPT and other agreements? Now, the shortcomings of the NPT would make for the subject of a whole other webinar, or even a series of webinars, but it seems clear that this central plank of the international non-proliferation regime is incapable of either holding the US and UK to basic account or of stopping this intended proliferation. So where does this leave us? As with Russell's own efforts in the past, as with the efforts of the Russell Foundation and others in the 80s, so with today. An urgent situation demands urgency, creativity, and determination from those who have heard the sounding of the alarm. And I think if Russell was around today, this would be something that he was very much focused on. That's it from me. Thanks.